Okay. People are coming in now. We'll just give it a minute or two.
I suppose give people 5 minutes now to get them to tune in.
Are we live or can I finish my dinner?
We're live, but we'll give it a minute.
There's nobody watching, is there not?
There's a few.
Okay, I won't finish my dinner then.
Okay.
It'll be my dessert when we're finished.
We've 10 or so people in now, so I think I'll start. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our discussion this evening. My name is Adrian Curran, and I'm a member of People Before Profit here in Galway. Tonight, we're going to discuss the housing emergency Galway is facing and some possible solutions to it. I'm joined by Councillor Tina McVeigh. Tina is the chair of the National Homeless and Housing Coalition and the People Before Profit Dublin City Councillor. And I'm joined by Derek Hambleton. Derek has been involved with An Taisce for the last 20 years. He's a former chairman and a member of the Planning Committee, and he'll be speaking on his own behalf this evening. So, if it wasn't clear before, the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the necessity of secure, suitable housing for all. Overcrowded or unsanitary living conditions make ideal breeding grounds for the virus. In terms of people living in congregated settings, there have been 32 outbreaks in nursing homes, 8 of them this week, 10 in direct provision centres, including here in Galway, 7 in homelessness services, and 7 in traveller accommodation. Recent years have seen homelessness figures skyrocket until the official figure reached over 10,000 last year. These official Department of Housing figures do not include the so-called hidden homeless, such as rough sleepers, people in domestic violence refuges, people couch surfing, people living in direct provision, people in transitional homes owned by local charities, etc. Emergency measures taken during the pandemic, such as a temporary evictions ban, rent freeze, and mortgage breaks, have seen a reduction in official homelessness to around 8,700. With these coming to an end, many are expecting a surge in homelessness to come. Official homelessness figures for Galway hit a record high of 309 in May 2019, a multiple of what it had been even a couple of years previously. Last year, the number of households experiencing homelessness in Galway rose by 20%. Cope Galway have also pointed out that the government figures underestimate the problem, as they do not take into account the 585 or so traveller families living on unauthorised sites, often in unsafe and unhygienic condition. It's important that we remember this weekend the 5th anniversary of the Carrick Mines fire that took 10 lives. Travellers are 13 times more likely to be homeless than the general population in the state. Approximately 4,400 households are on the Galway City Council housing waiting list. A fall-off in new housing developments during the recession and a surge in visitor numbers in recent years have combined to create a perfect storm in relation to the provision of housing. The added pressure of a huge student population and a lack of affordable purpose-built student accommodation means rental properties are often snapped up within minutes of being offered. Now we are seeing a continued trend of public land that should be used to build public housing being sold off to private developers. Derek is hopefully going to tell us more about some of these sites now. And the last thing I'll say is that if anyone watching has any questions at any point, just put them in the comments and I will put them to our speakers afterwards. So Derek, do you want to take over?
Yes. First of all, I just have to tell you a little bit about how I've become involved in such issues. As you rightly said, I've been involved with An Taisce, which is a non-political organisation, an NGO which is specifically targeted with heritage and planning issues. So it's from the planning perspective that I really want to sort of talk tonight. And as I say, I'm not speaking on behalf of An Taisce, I'm speaking on my own behalf. I've been a member of the City Council's Strategic Policy Committee on Planning for a number of years now. I was previously also on their Transport SPC. So it's the planning element that I have an interest in. I was brought up in a council housing estate, so I'm kind of well aware of all of the issues of social housing versus private housing and such like. As Adrian has pointed out, the homelessness issue in Galway has been growing over the years, and a number of different solutions as to how to deal with that have been publicised in recent years. But we've got this new problem that's been thrown at us now, which is COVID-19, and with all of the financial commitments that are now on government regarding people's health, the HSE, and keeping the country going, working, it's going to be much more difficult to see how government can properly fund future housing development. And typically we might see them revert back to relying on the private market to provide the housing that they're saying that the country needs. As you know, the programme for government is being ramped up and rolled out over previous months, and we're expected to see something like 25,000 new houses being constructed each year for the next number of years. I think we can all be a little bit sceptical about that. But I think Adrian wanted really to talk about the Galway situation and how things seem to be working out here. As I said, I'm on the planning SPC. I'm not on the housing SPC in City Council. So any discussions that go on around that table, I'm not privy to. But as you all know, Galway has become very reliant on the housing associations to provide homes for people to get off the homeless list. We've a specific problem, as everybody would remember, with rough sleeping. There are quite a lot of people still to be seen around the city, whether it's beside the canals or behind the railway station, down at the docks there, people sleeping in doorways. From what I can see, and of course we're all limited about being able to go into town, and with the pubs closed, I don't really have much reason to be going into town late at night these days. So, but I think it's still a problem. So specifically, I think we're meant to be talking tonight about solutions, and one of the solutions to ramp up the housing provision has been the establishment of this agency, government agency, called the Land Development Agency. And that's been working now for a couple of years, establishing itself, taking on staff. The last reading now, I think they had 20 to 30 staff in their office up in Dublin. And they've been going out around the country talking to local county managers and city managers about how they can help. We have seen newspaper articles and all kinds of reports about their cooperation with local authorities in specific areas, regeneration areas, which we would see in Galway as being listed. Initially, the Kent Station area and the docks area were on the target list for the Land Development Agency, but they seem to have been slipped off. Perhaps they've been put in the picture that's more of a private developer-led scheme at the moment. A number of different planning applications are in progress there, and of course with a planning application process which is kind of semi-legal, you're limited to what you could say about that. But what we're seeing actually is that there's been the creation of business hubs and office developments, and the perennial development for the last couple of years has been student accommodation, which developers have latched onto as being quite profitable. And of course, everybody in Galway knows that there is has been a problem of proper student accommodation for years. So nobody is saying that there shouldn't be proper student accommodation provided. But the planning applications that we've seen seem to be going far ahead of housing provision. There are many more housing units being provided for student accommodation, and of course in the summertime during the college holidays that actually is turning into tourist accommodation. If you were to go through the list of developments for student accommodation, if I had the list in front of me, I could tell you that it's going up to almost 24 now, particular projects which have been either built in the last 4 or 5 years or in the last 1 or 2 years are in the process of gaining their planning permissions. So there's a lot of new student accommodation being provided in the city. Housing development, private housing development continues and has speeded up, of course, with the recovery program, so that you've seen quite a lot of housing developments around the periphery of the city. If you can think of Duishka, what's happening out there in Roscam, coming round to Merview, there's 1 or 2 housing developments up in the Ballyban area, and then swinging around towards the Headford Road, quite a lot of activity down there, and coming across to the far side then Knocknacarra, still seeing quite a lot of housing development there. And then beyond that, you can go out to the peripheral areas beyond the city itself, just onto the fringes of the county, where you see a lot of housing, new housing development in Barna, and swinging up around Bowley-Beg and back around Oranmore is a small town now. It's no longer a village. Clare, Galway, Clarenbridge, all these places have seen a tremendous amount of new housing built, but all private housing, very little social housing. So this Land Development Agency is being targeted towards the development of social housing alongside local government and local authorities. So we've had a number of presentations. I've been privy to a Zoom meeting with the director of the Land Development Agency in Dublin, and we've seen it in our local newspapers, particular areas being targeted for cooperation as between the local authority and the Land Development Agency to see the development of new housing projects in the Sandy Road area, down on the Dyke Road, and has already been mentioned, the docks and the harbour area. There's another area that's also being in the early stages, if you like, of development now, which is Nuns Island, and there's a certain amount of housing that may go in there, but that again might see a lot more student accommodation being provided than actual housing. Some people might remember and would be aware that in the city development plan, developments down around the docks area and the station area, there was a provision in the planning statement there that all new developments, whether they be business developments, offices, hotels, whatever, there would be a 20% housing content or residential content, to use the proper word, because Residential in the Planning Acts these days can include the development of hotels. And we've 4 or 5 new large hotel developments at various stages of planning in the city. So in summing up my comments, we've seen an awful lot of building development, but a lot of it has been commercial development, hotel, offices, private housing developments. There's a certain amount of social housing now beginning to come through, but of course, as either Catherine or Colette Connolly would have told you, that for their 17 years on City Council, there were very few social housing developments coming through the system, and the housing list was growing. So before handing over to Tina or back to Adrian, just to sum up, the programme for government, of course, has proposed that the cities, the regional cities, should take a larger percentage of government funding. I think it's 60-40% to see the regional cities develop a greater amount of core housing to cut down on the commuting. In Galway, as you know, we've seen so much development of housing outside of the city in the county areas. And this has come about because of the 20-year-old Buchanan plan, the Buchanan Land Use and Transportation Study, that recommended that any of the towns within 40-kilometre radius of the city would be allowed develop lots of new housing to stimulate the towns in the county. Of course, the big issue with the Buchanan plan is that all of this would be reliant on a ring road being built around the city to allow all of this commuting to access the city where most of the employment is, of course, with the industrial estates, the business parks, and the major institutions, the colleges and the hospitals. So that's been going on for the last 20 years. You've seen an awful lot of housing and people moving out because it's been more affordable for people to move out of the city. Housing costs in Galway are quite high, and young couples hoping to start out have been forced to move out of the city and commute back to work or back into education, whatever. So that's been a big problem. The government have realised this. They've listened at last to the planning experts, and of course the climate issue has had a large part in the updating of planning policy. And so we're starting to see, and of course with the green element now in government, these issues being taken notice of, and we're starting hopefully to see things happen. And I think probably Tina, as an elected councillor in Dublin, would be much more expert about talking about these things than me. I'm only giving you a personal position as I've taken an interest in planning issues over the years. And I think that what we have to do, and what people before profit need to do, is to become more involved in campaigning for better planning and more use of local area plans, which is something that we found very difficult to get City Council to adopt. Local area plans are a device where, say along the Headford Road, there's been a local area plan promised for the Headford Road area for a good number of years. It's been in the last 2 city development plans, and there has been no local area plan produced. A local area plan, when it is produced, is a document setting out what it is that the local authority want to see built in a particular local area, a local plan area. It's then published so that there would be stakeholder involvement. Public can make comments, make observations, and give their own views before it's adopted by the local elected members. We've seen time and time again where a number of us on the planning SPC have looked for local area plans to be produced, even the ones that have been promised. We've been actually told that the City Council haven't the resources to produce local area plans. What they're saying is that they don't have the manpower or they don't have the financial wherewithal to employ consultants to draw up local area plans. So what's then happening, of course, is that it's being left to the market to decide what's being built. And that's what we've been seeing around the docks and the Kent Station area. The Land Development Agency, as I said at the beginning, let it be known that they were there to help the local authority with devising plans to introduce more housing into the centre of the city or central areas into the city itself. That hasn't happened in those particular areas, the docks or the harbour area, because it's being led by developer-led planning. We would be hopeful that we might see something a little bit more productive regarding social housing coming from the Sandy Road regeneration plan. But as regards the Dyke Road plan, again, I think that's being more targeted towards student accommodation, because they hope to get a footbridge erected on the piers of the old Galway Clifton railway line that would allow students stroll across from the Dyke Road directly into the campus there across the other side of the river. And that sounds a very good idea. But there should also be a housing element there which is available for ordinary people and mixed typology as well. Of course, this is the new in thing now, that in order to develop communities, which is what we all would like to see, being a small city like Galway, we have these indigenous communities in the different parts of town, whether you be brought up in Shantler or the Cladda, Bohemore, Merview, wherever. Individual community development, that's the watchword now. They're trying to develop new communities to integrate with the existing communities. But how this is going to happen is all up in the air, because if you're going to see a lot of apartment development in the core area of the centre of the city, it's going to be this kind of gentrification where people on an ordinary wage cannot afford to live, and a lot of that is going to be rental accommodation. It will be landlords buying up blocks of apartments and renting them out for holiday lets or Airbnb or whatever. It's not clear yet to me or to a lot of other people what we're going to see in the city centre as a result of these various regeneration projects, because the element of affordable housing, social housing, market housing for people to buy, to invest in, a lot of the development that's going into Galway at the moment is investment from investment companies, and some of them not Irish based. They're coming from abroad, so it's money being brought in and presumably the profits being taken back out again. But that's another issue. So I don't know if I've gone on long enough there, Adrian.
Thank you very much, Derek. Yeah, thanks for that.
At the end of it, if you like. Yeah.
We will go over to Councillor Tina McVeigh now.
Thanks, Adrian. And thanks very much.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak, and thanks very much to the Galway branch for organising this meeting, because it is, I think, really important to continue to talk about housing. It is, obviously an important aspect of the global health pandemic, because as Derek was alluding to, housing conditions also perpetuate people's conditions in their health, in terms of their health. And just to say to Derek that I don't know if I'm more expert than you, Derek, but I'm probably more pessimistic than you as a public rep, and the dealings I've had with the council. But just to say as well, I suppose, we talk about the housing crisis, and in terms of, why we're in the crisis and what the solution is. And the crisis in housing has been hurtling at us for decades. This isn't something that just, manifested in the last 4 or 5 years. It's something that we've seen coming at us. I mean, in 2008, when the property bubble burst, it was very obvious then. And the reason why, once we started seeing the very beginnings of the crisis and it was looming on the horizon, the reason why a stop wasn't put to it and something wasn't done about it is because we were locked in the battle, and we've been locked in this battle. And that's why the crisis has gotten worse, about, between people who believe that housing is for profit and those who believe that housing is for people. There's a human need and a human right to shelter. And those who believe that housing is for profit have been running the country for the last number of decades, in fact, a good number of decades, and have been in the pockets of developers. So over the years, they have consistently legislated for and created the frameworks for developers to make money out of housing, including things like stopping the building of social housing and shifting the responsibility for social housing to the private rented sector. So locked in that battle has created the crisis. And in the same way, the solutions to the crisis are also have us locked in this battle between those who believe that housing is for profit and those who believe that housing is for human need. And those of us who believe that housing is a human right would argue for the solution to be a mass programme of building of public housing on public land. And those who argue more for the market model that Derek referred to a couple of times, for housing is for profit, would see the solution coming very much from the market, from the private developers. And again, have continued to make sure that not just housing legislation, but planning legislation as well has facilitated that. So I'm going to tell a little story, I suppose, about how, why currently are we still in this situation where things are working out for developers and they're not working out so well for the rest of us, and things are working out for the people building student accommodation and the co-livings and the hotels. And the story is basically about a new group of lobbyists who formed themselves a number of years back, probably about 6 years ago. They came together. They were construction industry federation representatives. They were people like real estate agents. They were people who had money basically to invest, capital and vulture funds, etc., to invest in housing. And you probably remember around that time, at the height of when things had gotten really, really bad, and we were starting to see thousands of families coming into homelessness, people that we wouldn't have traditionally associated with homelessness. You might have remembered at the time we heard a lot of narrative around, it's too expensive to build. We can't, it's gone, the cost of building has gone through the roof and we can't build. And that's why it's too expensive for the public sector. So that's why we need the private developers to come in and build. And the people who were saying that it was too expensive to build were actually this group of lobbyists and the people that they represented. And actually for them, the truth is that it was too expensive to build, because when you factor in their profit margin, the cost of materials had gone up, the cost of labour had gone up. But when you factor in their profit margin, they weren't going to be able to make a profit. They had to start, getting the attention of government and saying to them, listen, you've got these high standards for housing, in terms of the size of a bedroom, in terms of the height of the ceiling, in terms of how much light you let in terms of the energy ratings. These standards are too high, and we just can't, we can't afford to build anymore according to these standards, and we can't afford to build your traditional, two up, two down, or your nice apartment buildings. So to cut a long story short, they got the ear of the government, and they went in and sat down with the housing minister of the day, which was Simon Coveney, and then Owen Murphy. And basically what they did was convinced, and Alan Kelly from the Labour Party before them, they convinced these successive housing ministers of this argument that it's too expensive to build. And what we need to do is we need to lower the standards, and we need to keep people out. There's too many objections to planning. We need to keep the democracy out of the planning process. We need to reduce the standards, and you need to make it really, really easy for us to build things like student accommodation, things like the co-living, because if you're building co-living, and the latest scheme that we have in Dublin is to have on 391 co-living units in one, and this is in the area that I represent in Dublin 8, 391 units in one scheme. The bedrooms are tiny. On a one floor alone, there's going to be 64 of these bedrooms that they call, residential units. And there's 4 kitchens to be shared between those 60 odd bedrooms. So think about it, it's much, much cheaper for developers to build, because they're not building, they're building basically just box rooms, and then every now and again a slightly bigger kitchen. So this was the discussion that was held between these developers and the government. And lo and behold, following those intense lobbying discussions, we saw in 2015 and in 2018 a whole load of what they call ministerial directives, which basically is an order from a minister who said, all those lovely standards, and Derek mentioned the local area plans, those lovely standards you have in your development plans, those lovely local area plans that you have, all of that is now thrown out and is now superseded by these new guidelines. And these new guidelines allow them to build as high as they want with a minimum of standards. They allow for wall-to-wall, excuse the pun, wall-to-wall student accommodation, wall-to-wall co-living, and wall-to-wall hotels, and because that's where the money is to be made. And the build to rent, etc. So this is what has happened. This is why, when you say we need to campaign about planning, absolutely we do. But it's back to the point. It's back to this battle that we're locked in, which is the battle between that development class and the capitalist, the capital class, the people who've got the money, who've got the ear of successive, housing ministers, and who want to make money and believe that they have a right to make money out of housing, versus those of us who believe that, essentially, that's amoral. That the idea that in the height of a housing crisis that you would sit down and have those conversations and allow that to happen, and that in an area in Dublin 8 where we've got thousands and thousands and thousands of people languishing on social housing lists, and we've got massive overcrowding, and we've got people paying through the nose for substandard accommodation in the private rented sector. When you have those conditions, and we're allowing the solution to be provided as something like a co-living scheme, or the student accommodation schemes for students, then that is something that we absolutely have to fight against, and have to, as you said, Derek, you're absolutely correct. We need to campaign to overturn that toxic legislation. But more importantly, what we need to do is to campaign to win the argument that, because if you lock housing to the market, the only driver is profit, and then we don't get good, reasonable, affordable accommodation. We have to campaign for public housing on public land, because when you look at the costs of housing, land is the most expensive part of it. And if we're building public housing on public land, then the argument should follow that we're keeping the cost down and we're making it affordable for people. And I know that in Galway there's a proposal to sell off public land, and this is what we've seen an awful lot of in Dublin City Council, are these proposals to sell public land off to developers. And you're absolutely correct, Derek, about the fact that the councils have been starved of funding to build public housing on public land. So the problem is not the land, we have the land. But they come into us, the management of the council come into us and they say, look, we don't have the money to build housing on this land. We have no choice but to sell this land to developers. So what we've seen in Dublin City Council, and we've waged a war on this, is again, certain parties, including the government parties, who will say, who'll say, oh, look, it's not an ideal world. And in an ideal world, of course, we wouldn't be agreeing to sell off the public land, but we don't have a choice here. It's the only solution. We'll negotiate a little bit more. So instead of getting 30% social and affordable housing, let's get 50%. And everyone's happy with that. So this is the arguments that are put forward, the justifications for selling off the land, because a bird in the hand is better than 2 in the bush. But at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're stripping away all of the public assets. That once the land is gone, it's gone, and then we will have no public land left, and we'll have handed it all over to private interests. So there is hope. and this is part of this is coming to the solution. One example in Dublin was a large piece of public land it's called the St. Michael's Estate, which is again in Dublin 8. And that's a local authority housing estate that had been promised regeneration for a long number of years, and they did detenant and demolish the blocks just before the financial crash in 2008, so that when the crash happened, of course, the regeneration programme went off the table. And that was one of the sites that the council had earmarked to sell. But the community then and actually there was a battle waged in the council, and there was a small number of us who fought against the sale, but it went through. And the community actually went crazy. They were absolutely livid about this. And because, they listened to the debates in the council, and they listened to the narrative around, oh, you don't want to have all social tenants because, antisocial and so they were livid at the idea that that's how they would be represented. And they were livid at parties like Sinn Féin, for example, who had voted to sell off the land. Livid at them for two reasons. One, because they were continuing to stigmatise them and allowing that kind of stigma. But number two, because they had voted to sell off the land. So a campaign was waged where Sinn Féin and other political parties who voted for it were basically brought in and told in no uncertain terms by the community that they now needed to overturn their decision, and they needed to campaign to save that site. And the case that they put was that they would campaign for like 100% public housing, and that 70% of it would be cost rental. And the idea behind cost rental is that it is accommodation that's affordable and available to people who don't qualify for local authority housing. So essentially, what we're saying is that all housing should be public to people on a broad range of incomes, and whether it's cost rental or whether it's through the local authority housing list as it is now. We and People Before Profit would argue that really what a cost rental scheme involves is just increasing the income thresholds so that we make public housing available to whoever wants it, and you pay your rent according to your income. So to cut a long story short, that campaign won, and they won building cost rental and social and affordable 100% on that site, and that's now being designed, and they're expecting to go for planning permission in the new year. So I suppose the moral of the story is that you have to organise and you have to mobilise. And if there's a piece of land in Galway which is under threat of being sold off to private developers, then what I would be looking at doing is waging a huge campaign and building public momentum. Have you lost me there? Oh, no, you haven't. I don't know how much.
Yeah, no, far away.
But anyway, I was just making the point that it is part of the solution. Part of the solution, of course, is constantly making the case for public housing. But on the ground, the solution is mobilising around the sale of that piece of land, getting people on board with that, and putting pressure on the councillors to propose alternatives, and to use the examples of the models in Dublin where that has happened, and I'm sure in other parts of the country as well, to stop the sell-off of private land, of public land rather, that could be used for public housing. And just to finish on the question of the Land Development Agency, because I'm a little bit cynical about the Land Development Agency. I think it's too good to be true that suddenly the government sets up this wonderful group who are going to come in and help help us to build local authority housing. And I'm cynical for two reasons. Three reasons. I'm sure I could find a lot more. But if you look, first of all, at the composition of the LDA, it's made up of people who've been involved in NAMA, estate agents, developers, that kind of class of people. That's the first reason. The second reason is they've come into, in Dublin City Council, they've come into another piece of land which is being regenerated. It's a very, very large plan to build close to 1,000 homes in St. Teresa's Gardens. And this site is right next door to another site that's owned privately, and that's being developed by the private developers. But the council have told us that now the Land Development Agency are coming in to develop the public side of it, but that we will have to sell them to the Land Development Agency the site because they need to attract in private money. Unless we sell them the deeds, they have to have control of the asset, and this is their language. They have to have control of the asset in order to raise the private funding. So And then the third reason is because we are expecting a new legislation on the Land Development Agency, which is coming down the line very, very soon. When we asked in the Dáil, the government told us that they expect to have it done and dusted by December. So it's going to be coming down the line any minute now. And I fully expect, just from things I've seen and things I've heard and things I've read, that legislation is going to give the Land Development Agency even more powers to sell the land that they get from the council, because they own it, that they will have powers to sell that on, much in the same way that NAMA did. So just to summarise, the solution is public housing on public land, removing the thresholds and making public housing available to anyone who wants it, contributing according to their need. And part of that solution has to be mobilising and building a strong fight back and a strong movement on the ground to fight for that right to a home.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that. I might go to some of the questions and comments we have coming in now from the viewers. We have one here that I'll bring up on the screen. Can you both see this, or will I read it out? Yeah, so basically it's about not just the need for housing on public land, but public facilities generally, community centres, playgrounds, sports facilities. You could throw in childminding, maybe cultural hubs and that kind of thing as well into that. Would either of you like to come in on that?
Well, certainly Felix there has mentioned a particular area of Galway, Knocknacarra, not having any community facilities. I'm long enough living in Galway, 40 years now, to remember that in Merview, in Renmore, Chantala, they had no community facilities, and it was always the housing that was built first, and then it took years, and in some cases 30 years, before a community facility was built, and that's been the pattern here for years now. I don't think there was ever a town plan drawn up for Knocknacarra. It just grew with private houses, private developers acquiring bits of land. So the suburb of Knocknacarra just grew with housing and not even schools for a period of time. Kids had to come into town to get to school. But then that all started to change, and as money became available, these things were added. But they're always added after, and in some cases long after. So it's a lack of proper planning. That's the way I would see it.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
Well, that's a good point about planning. I mean, interestingly, in Ireland, you have city councils and town councils developing their plans for development, but it's not a legal requirement. You put into the development plans that you want to have all of the community amenities and facilities that we need to have in order to build, sustainable communities. But it's not a legal requirement that you have to build them at the same time or even before you build the housing. And part of the reason for that, again, is back to the profit logic. It's not profitable to build a community centre. It's not a revenue generator, but building a house that you can sell or rent is.
It's a cost. Yeah.
And again, and Felix is absolutely correct. On public land, we can make the case for that, and because we already own the land, and so the argument would be that it's
land should be reserved for these facilities at the time they start developing an area. There should be particular parts of an area where it's planned to put your community centre. It's planned where you should put your school, and they should all be marked out on the map so that you know you're not going to get them immediately. That's just the way things are. But you know that it's coming. But we don't even have that really. The land is not reserved.
Well, one of the arguments that we made in the campaign that I was in St. Michael's, the example that I gave of where the decision to sell the land was reversed and we won the cost rental model, the 100% public housing the site. And actually this was a demand driven by residents, is that actually they don't want that to happen. They don't want housing built and no community amenities, because that's been part of the problem in the past. So the community have demanded, and this is the wider community have demanded, that the amenities and the facilities have to be built either before or at the same time as the housing, and this is to be stitched in to the tender document.
That's the way it should be.
There's another related question here, I suppose, from Garage about this is something we've seen in some of the plans for some of the public land sites in Galway about cinemas and retail and offices being included kind of as revenue generators. But I mean, first of all, we have a lot of cinemas in Galway to start with, but aside from that, considering the pandemic, I mean, it's highly likely a lot of these retail and office spaces are going to be left empty, you know, once they're built, whereas housing would offer so much more public good, you know.
Yeah, I think a response to those kind of ideas is that, you know, because of, as Derek alluded to earlier on in his contribution as well, is that we do have to factor in how we live, considering the need to respond to climate change. And to reduce emissions. So I think, you know, it's and again, you know, coming back to the example that I'm using of St. Michael's Estate, like it's really, really important that we create communities that people don't have to, you know, massively move out of in order to meet their day-to-day needs. So I think retail space and workspaces in local areas are a good thing, because then you create much more vibrant and sustainable local economies and local communities. And you know, when you have schools and crashes and community facilities and recreational facilities that we're talking about, so that we can live in you know, we do need to think about living more densely. So I think that's, you know, like, I'm hoping that we're going to find solutions to the pandemic that you know, allow us in some ways to get back to normal life, possibly adjusted, but we get back to it. But when we get back to it, we need to think about how we live more sustainably and reduce the need for jumping into your car because you have to drive 3 miles to get a pint of milk.
Yeah, I did a calculation about 10-15 years ago, it's quite a while back now, that we had 28 shopping centres in Galway. You might find that hard to believe, you know, but if you pick out the small shopping areas, precincts where there's 2 or 3 shops, up to the very largest sort of drive-in shopping centre that we now have all around the city, there's something like 28 different shopping centres. And if you look at the city centre, which is dying with number of shops closed, that's the pattern of development that you're going to see for some time now. Somebody mentioned their particular development that's underway at the moment, the planning for it, at least the one at Kent Station, Augustine Hill. That's based on a model of height. Now we're talking about a 21-story apartment block in the medieval heart of Galway. Of course, the government policy is that tall buildings should be in brownfield areas, such as stations. I think they might have been thinking about Dublin, where your stations are sort of away from the city centre, and even docklands you see there down the river. So building tall buildings in Dublin and in former docklands is not the wrong idea. It's probably the right idea, but maybe it's too much of the one thing, you know. That's what's coming here in Galway. We're seeing 21-story, 19-story, 16-story. There are 8 or 10 different blocks in this one development of varying heights, and as somebody said, they're including a cinema and various restaurants and retail facilities. There are going to be shopping centres involved in this development. We've already got these 28 shopping centres, including the core of Galway, which is dying on its feet. So, and as I said, it's about private development for profit. The apartments are going to be for rent, or they're going to be for sale, and the percentage of social housing included in that development, it might fit the statutory requirement, but is very much at the lower end, and that's a real problem. And this, of course, is all on public land. It's CIE land. The people own it through CIE. The docks land is the harbour company, which is a commercial semi-state. It's public land that's being sold off. There's an application in just this week for an old unused building to be demolished, to be cleared out of the way, to be readied for sale, so that a site on the Locatalia Road will be ready for sale to a private developer, presumably, when they're trying to fund their new extension to the port, which I don't see ever happening. It's not necessary. We don't need that kind of facility in Galway. We've had a port for 200 years that has hardly ever made a profit and is only kept going because it earns £1 million plus charging people to park their cars in the city centre. It would be in the red if it wasn't for the car parking income that it gains. So you've 32 acres of land there, which is available for development. But it's the type of development that you're going to see, which is being currently talked about and has been talked about for the last 10 or 15 years. There's been a titanic struggle. A planning application was submitted in 2014, and now here we are 6 years later, and An Bord Pleanála still haven't made a decision on that land. So it's not the objectors that are holding this up. It's the planning that's the problem. It's the wrong kind of planning.
Thanks, Derek. I might put one question to you, Tina. We'll wrap up fairly shortly. About existing council houses that are left lying empty sometimes for years. This is something we see in certain areas of the city when we're out going door to door canvassing, and this, that there are some council houses just lying empty for years at a time, and it's very frustrating, you know. Do you have much experience dealing with that in your line of work?
Yeah, I mean, we asked the council about the same problem in Dublin, not so much now as it used to be a few years ago, but the answer from the council management is that they don't get the funding, enough funding from the state to turn around the houses. I mean, every house that's handed back has to be brought up to current standards in terms of energy ratings and things like that. So some of them require very, very deep refurbishments. And the council management will tell you as well. I mean, there's one house in our area where they reckon it'll cost about 80 grand to do a deep refurbishment of it. And as the council said, I can do 4 houses at 20 grand each, or I can do 1 house at 80 grand. So when they're limited in terms of how much funding they get from the state, then they have to make these kind of choices. And it comes back to, again, the ideology and the shift away from the public provision of housing over the last decades hasn't just been in terms of constructing new housing, but it's also been in running down existing housing and not maintaining. And that's why we see, the larger council estates that need to be regenerated, because they have been absolutely neglected by the state, not just in terms of neglecting the people, in terms of providing them with opportunities for jobs and decent incomes and standards of living, but also then in terms of the actual bricks and mortar and how not just the units, the building, but also how the public realm around it is maintained. So there's been that push to run it down, and then it's easier to make the case for moving people out and regenerating it. But our experience in Dublin around those regeneration schemes is that they find a way to then not really regenerate them in the end. Like, the community doesn't actually come back. It takes so long to turn it around that the community has become resettled. So in the end, what ends up happening is that those lands are then available to sell off. And that's also been a strategy of the state.
Thanks. We'll try and wrap up for 8:30. We'll let people watch the second half of the Ireland match. We might just... I'm
watching it as I'm here.
We might just, to wrap up, go back to you, Tina, about what people can do to campaign on this issue, and why people should look to people for profit to to get involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose it's the same answer to both of your questions. It's because, what we can do is mobilize on the ground and build, campaigns around the issue of the sale of public land. So if there is a site that is under threat of being sold, a council-owned site that's being under threat, then to mobilise people around that and to start building a campaign around that. And the reason why you should get involved with People Before Profit is because that is what we do. We have a track record of working on the ground with communities, in communities, to campaign on the issues that affect people's lives. And we have loads of examples of when we've won. Most recently, for example, Repeal the Eighth. We that's a classic example of where involvement with the left-wing parties delivered this kind of social change that we needed. And as I said, People Before Profit have a track record of doing that. And we also have a huge track record as well of campaigning on housing. As you mentioned earlier, when you introduced me, I've been involved in setting up and been involved with the National Homeless and Housing Coalition now for almost 8 years. And we've had fantastic successes in terms of mobilising people, but it's not just about mobilising people on the streets, which is important. It's also mobilising around particular locations and building awareness, I suppose, in your community in Galway of what's at stake. So I think that's a really important thing to do. If there is any kind of an appetite with locals, with people who live close to the site, with people who live on the site, if they're still living there, I would really encourage you to try and build a campaign around that, and any kind of support that we can give you from Dublin, we'd be absolutely delighted to do that. But it's only, we can't leave it to the politicians. I mean, I know that's rich coming from a politician, but you can't leave it to the politicians. This has to be about people power and people-led change in communities. And the people who are experiencing the problem, in my view, are the people who can fix the problem, and that's the people.
Thanks very much. That's a good note to end on, I think. People power all the way. I'd just like to thank Derek Hambleton and Councillor Tina McVeigh for joining me. And I'd also like to thank David O'Keefe for the technical help running this. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Well done for organising, Adrian. Nice to meet you, Tina.
Likewise, and power to the people.
Good luck, everyone.